Vi har stor tro på at dette kan være et fantastisk spennende forum for å føre denne diskusjonen videre. Og saken er at vi alle må forstå hva som faktisk foregår med økonomien. Og hvordan den legger premissene for alt det vi gjør. Og det er også veldig ambisiøst å tro at vi faktisk kan endre disse rådende, globale, nasjonale og lokale systemene. Men det er faktisk det vi skal gjøre. Det er faktisk det vi må gjøre. Vi har ikke noe valg. Og vi er nødt også til å si ja til livsbejaende systemer. Vi må gjøre det på en måte som vi har tenkt å fortsette med i all overskuelig fremtid. So, it's time for a reality check. And David Attenborough, he said, anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. Ross Jetson, he is an expert in international finance and operations research. He's a far-sighted and innovative leader both in the business and the NGO world. He was born in Canada and has since 1964 lived in Denmark with his wife and partner Hildu, who's also here. They live on an organic farm just outside Copenhagen. He has a PhD in operations research, which is the science of problem solving, which I think could be very useful in this context. He's been a successful businessman and independent management consultant in the field of information technology, specializing in investment and international finance. He's director and owner of Urtekram, Scandinavia's largest wholesale organic food company. And he's former chairman of Gaia Corp, a company that specialized in currency fund management. Ross knows the system from within, and I think this is crucial to, I don't think there are many people in the world that could have written the book that Ross has written. He has used his proceeds, 90% of the proceeds he got from his financial transactions went into Gaia Corp to create, amongst other things, the Gaia Trust. This is a foundation that supports GEN, the Global Eco-Village Network, and Gaia Education, as well as hundreds of sustainability projects all over the world. This spring he published the book Occupy Wall Street, a global roadmap for radical economic and political reform that has inspired this seminar. We have decided to divide Ross's talk into two parts. And the first part is going to be the bad news, all about the problems that we are actually facing, or the challenges that we're facing. We've called it the assault on people and nature, unmasking the neoliberal economic system and the corporatocracy. It's a very difficult word to say, but we'll try. Okay, thank you, Russ. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to you today about a number of ideas on my book, Occupy Wall Street, which just came out about 6 months ago in the USA and in the UK. Just a word perhaps about the title. You might be wondering why it's called the Occupy Wall Street. I'm sure you've all heard of Occupy Wall Street. How many have heard of Occupy Wall Street? That's pretty much everybody, right? And they came on the scene around September, October last fall. And at that time, actually, I had been working on this book for about 6 years, and it was about to go to print when the Occupy movement suddenly appeared. And one day my publisher in Vermont, Chelsea Green, called up and said, Ross, maybe we should change your title. Because after all, what your book is all about is all the issues that are raised by the Occupy movement. And so, but the difference is that my book deals with it at the global level, not just at the USA level. And beyond that, it also includes a lot of suggestions for solutions. So that was the idea, and I said, fine, let's do it. The old title was actually called The Breakaway Strategy, which is a strategy I'll come back to in the second half of my talk today when we talk about the solutions. I think we owe a lot to the Occupy movement, because what they have done is they put right on the very front burner a lot of these issues which have not been discussed sufficiently in our society. And that is the very fundamental questions about the whole economic system. So I think we owe them a lot. And I'd like to, in the first chart here, illustrate exactly where they're coming from. I think this chart illustrates very, very clearly why there's such unrest among the Occupy movement. The top part of this chart shows for the USA, how income growth increased in the period 1950 to 78 for the 5 different fractals of the American economy. And you'll notice that the increase in income was pretty much evenly distributed. In fact, the lowest 20% actually had the biggest increase in this period. See how the distribution shifted dramatically. Now we see that the lowest 20% fractile only increased by 1%, while the top fractile by 75%. And if we look at even more detail, the top 1% was up 200%. And the top 0.1%, 390%. That's almost a quintupling of income of those who already were wealthy. So this is really telling the story. The Occupy movement is pointing out this tremendous shift that's occurred since around 1980. And one of the points I want to make to you today is to ask the question, what was it that happened around 1980 that caused this major shift? And it's not only the question of income, it's also affecting our ecological system, our social system, the economic system. All 3 of these areas have deteriorated fantastically in this period. And that's the question we want to come back to later on and say why. This next diagram illustrates some of the same numbers just graphically. Here we can see, for some people, it makes a greater impact to see it on a graph, but this is basically the same numbers, the 390% at the top for the 0.01%. The bottom 90%, almost nothing. Here's another way of looking at it. One of the things that happened in this period was that the financial sector in the United States gained a much more dominant position. This top diagram, it shows the red curve at the top, shows the part of the total income of society which was due to the financial sector, and the black line is everything else. And so we see until around 1980 or so, the two followed pretty much in parallel. Banking and finance was pretty mundane, before that time. There wasn't anything so spectacular as it's become since then. So something very dramatic happened because more and more of our total economic production was flowing into the financial sector. Then after 1980, we see almost an explosion in CEO compensation, reaching a maximum of over 500 times worker salaries around the time of 2000, just before the dot-com crash. And that's what knocked it down quite a bit after 2000. Came back again and got hit again. But today, the ratio is certainly above 300 to 1. Now, just for comparative purposes, in Europe, the corresponding ratios have been fairly stable, around 25 to 1 throughout this whole period. We haven't had the same phenomenon happening here, although there has been some degree of increase, but it's been, relatively speaking, much more modest. So now let's look at these 3 areas, the social, ecological, and economic, and see what has been happening since 1980 compared to previous. This next diagram shows what's called the Gini Coefficient, which sociologists use to measure inequality in society. And this is an average figure for the entire world. As the Gini Coefficient increases, it means greater inequality. So what we have here is an increasing inequality over the entire world. And we see once again, a relatively flat curve until around 1980, and then a sudden increase. Very dramatic increase since then. That's really quite amazing. And if we look at it in more detail, we see that this trend, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, is not only a phenomenon between rich countries and poor countries, but it's happened within individual countries at the same time. Even here in Scandinavia, although on a much more modest scale, we've seen the same, increasing gap between rich and poor. Suppose the gap is increasing, what does it matter? It's not just a question of morality, whether we think it's unfair or not. This has direct consequences on our entire well-being. And this next diagram here is taken from a study by 2 UK researchers, Wilkinson and Pickett, who wrote a book called The Spirit Level. And in this book, they began to look at the relationship between first of all, income and happiness. And the first thing they found was that there was no relationship. When asking different countries around the world, the self-estimate of how happy they felt, it turns out it was quite independent of their material goods, of their actual income. This is a major attack on the whole idea of economic growth. After all, why do our politicians use economic growth as a target, as a desirable thing? Well, it's because the implicit assumption is that if we have more things, we'll be happier. And they should have put a nail right through that hypothesis, which is why I think this is a very important study. But they went further, because they also looked at the relationship between health and inequality. And that's what this diagram shows. They developed an index of health problems with 10 different categories, including both physical, mental health problems. This is shown on the vertical axis. So the higher up you are, the more health problems you have according to their index. And then on the horizontal axis, we have a measure of income inequality. With the United States actually way off the chart almost as the country with the greatest inequality and the worst health problems. And at the same time, they're the country in the world which uses the most money. Isn't that amazing? This is a very, very important study. Because what it's showing is that we don't have to be getting more and more material things. It's actually destroying our health, and it's not making us happier. So it's quite possible to envisage a world in which we have a much lower level of consumption and be actually happier and healthier than we are today. We could almost call it a win-win-win proposition by spending less money on all these illnesses, but having a more egalitarian society. So we increase our health, we increase our happiness, and we decrease our costs. It's such an obvious solution, and this is where we have to go. Now, let's look at the next question, the environmental costs of this period. Once again, we see a steadily increasing curve, and once again, we see a dramatic crossing occurring a little later than 1980. This is a graph of the so-called ecological footprint globally. That is to say, it's a measure of the impact of humanity on the environment. And it's a widely used measure, published regularly by the World Wildlife Fund. While the green line at the center represents 1.0 planets. In other words, when we hit the green line, we're basically consuming everything that is provided by the sun through photosynthesis, plant life, and animal life, in which we are dependent upon. This is the point at which we're using 100% of the renewable resources. It doesn't look at non-renewable, just renewable resources produced by the sun. If we go back to, say, 1960 at the left, we were only using about 55% of the capacity. So everything looked pretty sustainable. Then we went through this, the point of biocapacity around 1990 or 1985, and since then it's continued to increase. So today, I think as Oyvind mentioned, that we're using almost 1.5 planets worth of renewable resources each year. And so we're actually not just living off the, you might say, the dividend or the yield of our natural capital. We're actually eating up the capital, which is of course something which cannot be sustainable. Eventually, any species which lives off its actual capital, not just the yield on that capital, is heading for extinction. And it's perhaps no accident that we're in the greatest period of species extinction that we've seen in 65 million years. And this time it's man-made. And by the way, this curve is increasing at the rate of about 2% per annum. It just can't continue. And one of the problems here is that we don't know what the consequences are going to be, because nature is so complex. We don't understand the details of how nature works. There are so many feedback mechanisms that it's a very complex system. For example, 100 years ago, who imagined that burning fossil fuels was going to result in a threat to our very survival due to global warming? And there are probably a lot of other surprises in store for us of that type in the future.